The holiday table at the Whitmore family estate had never looked more beautiful, and Eleanor Whitmore had never felt more invisible sitting at it. The dining room of the Whitmore property in Greenwich, Connecticut was the kind of room that appeared in architectural magazines without requiring any staging. 14-foot coffered ceilings painted the precise shade of antique cream that takes 3 rounds of custom mixing to achieve. A Murano glass chandelier that Eleanor's grandmother had shipped from Venice in 1962. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking 4 acres of manicured grounds that went white and silent under December snow every year, like the whole property was holding its breath. The table seated 22. It was set tonight for 18, the extended Whitmore family, 2 of her father's oldest business associates and their wives, the family attorney Gerald Foss, who came every year and drank too much Bordeaux and laughed too loudly at her father's jokes, and the Whitmore family's housekeeper of 31 years, Rosa, who always sat at the far end near the kitchen door and who was, Eleanor had long believed, the only person in the room who actually saw everything clearly. The food was extraordinary, as it always was. Rosa had been cooking this meal for 3 decades. The crown roast, the gratin dauphinoise, the haricots verts with toasted almonds, the persimmon pudding that nobody else in Connecticut knew how to make correctly. The Bordeaux was a 2015 Chateau Pichon Baron that her father had been saving for what he periodically described as a significant occasion. The candles were lit. The silver was polished. The centerpiece was fresh winter greenery and white roses and sprigs of something fragrant that Rosa had cut from the garden that morning before the snow came. Eleanor sat in her usual place. The left side of the table, middle, neither near enough to the head to suggest prominence nor far enough to suggest banishment. The position of someone who has spent 41 years being carefully managed into the margins of a room she was born in. She was wearing a bottle green cashmere dress she had bought herself in London the previous autumn, and her dark hair was pulled back in the understated way she had learned, years ago, signaled competence rather than effort, and she had driven up from Manhattan that afternoon in her own car with a bottle of wine for Rosa and a tin of the specific shortbread Rosa liked from a Scottish bakery on the Upper East Side, and she had sat through the pre-dinner drinks and the first 2 courses and the conversation that swirled around her brother Ashton the way conversation in this family always swirled around Ashton, warm, admiring, gravitational, with the patient composure of a woman who has had 41 years to make peace with the shape of things. Or the appearance of peace, anyway, which is a different thing. Eleanor Whitmore knew the difference between those 2 things better than she knew almost anything else. Ashton Whitmore was 38 years old, 14 months younger than Eleanor, and he had been the sun around which the Whitmore family system orbited since approximately the moment of his birth. This was not a bitter exaggeration. It was simply the observable mechanics of the family Eleanor had grown up in, as unremarkable and load-bearing as the structure of the house itself. Ashton was charming in the way that people are charming when they have never had to work for a room's attention. Easy, magnetic, slightly careless, the way people are slightly careless when they have always known the net will catch them. He had their father's jaw and their mother's social fluency, and a laugh that arrived in a room before he did. He had been given the better bedroom, the newer car, the more prominent seat at family dinners, the benefit of every doubt in every conflict with his sister, and the unwavering, uncomplicated belief of both parents that he was exceptional in ways that Eleanor was simply not. Not because Eleanor had failed to demonstrate otherwise, but because the story had been decided before the evidence was in, the way family stories often are, and once a story like that is decided, it takes more than evidence to move it. Eleanor had been an exceptional student. This was noted and appreciated but not treated as significant, because academic excellence was, in the Whitmore family's private hierarchy, a secondary virtue, useful, respectable, somewhat expected, but not the animating quality. The animating quality was the particular social and commercial magnetism that Ashton radiated and that Eleanor, by the family's assessment, simply did not possess in equal measure. She was the quiet one. She was the serious one. She was so capable. That specific compliment that functions as a consolation prize in family systems where capability is less valued than charisma. She had been told she was capable so many times and in so many contexts that the word had begun to feel, by her mid-30s, less like a compliment and more like a category she'd been sorted into to make room for Ashton's louder virtues. She had left Greenwich for Manhattan at 22 with a business degree from Yale, a small apartment in the East Village that she furnished herself from second-hand shops and a single extravagant splurge on a proper mattress, and the very clear understanding that she was leaving not because she had been driven out but because she had chosen, deliberately and with full understanding of what it meant, to build something of her own rather than wait at the edge of something that was never going to be fully hers. She had built it. That was the part of Eleanor Whitmore's story that the Whitmore family, gathered around the holiday table in Greenwich with the Bordeaux and the crown roast and the Murano chandelier, did not know with any precision, because Eleanor had not told them and they had not asked in the way that requires a real answer. They knew she worked in finance. They knew she had done well for herself. Her father occasionally referenced her with the mild, distant pride of a man acknowledging something peripheral to his main concerns. Her mother asked at every holiday whether she was seeing anyone and received the same answer, "I'm focused on work right now," and responded with the small, patient smile of a woman who believed her daughter was missing the point. What the Whitmore family did not know was that Eleanor Whitmore was, as of the previous quarter's valuation, the founder and managing partner of Whitmore Capital Advisors, a private wealth management and alternative investment firm with $11 billion in assets under management. She had started it at 28 with two colleagues from her first job, a two-room office in Midtown that she had furnished with the same approach she'd used for her East Village apartment, functionally, carefully, with one quality piece that signaled you were serious, and a philosophy of investment that was unfashionable at the time and had proven over 13 years to be correct with a consistency that had attracted the kind of clients who do not advertise their financial relationships. She had 340 employees. She had offices in Manhattan, London, and Singapore. She had been on the cover of a financial publication 3 years ago in a profile she had agreed to reluctantly and which had been headlined, with the journalist's characteristic precision, "The billionaire nobody saw coming." Her net worth, independently assessed, was $1.3 billion. She had not shown this profile to her parents. They had not asked. What the Whitmore family also did not know, what no one at that holiday table except Eleanor and Gerald Foss and the estate's attorney of record understood, was that Richard Whitmore, Eleanor and Ashton's father, had made a decision 9 years ago that had changed everything about how this evening was going to end. But we will get to that. Because first there was the toast. If your mother stood up at a family dinner and announced that your brother would inherit everything your family built, while you sat there knowing the truth, would you stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you let the papers do the talking? Tell us in the comments right now. And if you have ever been the overlooked one in your family who went out and built something extraordinary on your own, hit that like button and subscribe because Eleanor Whitmore's story is your story too, and it does not end the way anyone at that table was expecting. To understand the weight of what Richard Whitmore did 9 years ago, and why he did it, you have to understand what Eleanor had been doing for the decade before that. And to understand that, you have to understand what it cost her to leave. She had left Greenwich at 22 with her Yale degree and her second-hand furniture and the very precise knowledge of exactly what she was leaving behind. Not just the house and the family and the particular smell of the Greenwich estate in winter, wood smoke and cold pine and roses cooking, but the possibility of being seen clearly by the people whose seeing had mattered most to her. She had spent 22 years trying, in the ways available to her, to be visible to her parents in a form they could value. She had brought home perfect grades and been told kindly that she should also try to be less serious. She had argued at 16 that the family's primary investment portfolio was overweight in a way that would cost them in the next downturn, and had been correct, and had been told by her father that she was very sharp but that these decisions were his to make. She had, at 19, put together a 14-page analysis of an acquisition opportunity her father had been considering and shown him why the target company's revenue projections were based on assumptions that would not hold, and had been right about that too, and had received in return a pat on the shoulder and the observation that she should consider law school. She had spent 22 years being right and being patted on the shoulder and watching Ashton arrive late to every conversation with no preparation and leave with everyone's attention and warmth and the specific quality of admiration that the Whitmore family reserved for people who reminded them of themselves at their best. She had left and she had built Whitmore Capital with two colleagues named James Osei and Priyanka Mehta, both of whom were brilliant and both of whom remain to this day her closest professional partners and among her closest friends. She had built it in the specific way that people build things when they have something to prove and have decided, maturely and permanently, to stop caring whether they prove it to anyone in particular and simply do the work. She had worked 15-hour days in the first 3 years. She had slept on the office couch twice during particularly brutal market periods. She had made decisions that her more cautious competitors called reckless and that turned out, consistently, to be correct. She had grown the firm from 2 rooms and 3 people, and their collective savings to 100 employees and $3 billion in AUM in 7 years, which was the point at which the financial press began paying attention and the kind of clients who matter began arriving without needing to be solicited. She had not called her parents to tell them about any of it. Not because she was keeping it from them exactly, the information was available, the press coverage was real, they could have looked, but because she had made a decision somewhere in her late 20s that she was no longer going to manage her family's perception of her as a project. If they wanted to know who she was and what she was doing, they could ask in the way that requires a real answer. They did not ask in that way. They asked whether she was seeing anyone and told her about Ashton's latest project and passed the potatoes. What she did not know was that her father was watching. Not in the way she had always wanted to be watched. Not with the warm vocal, look at my daughter pride she had needed from him when she was 12 and 16 and 22 and had long since stopped needing. In a different way. Quieter way. The way that a man who understands money and who has spent his life underestimating his daughter begins to understand, when her firm appears in the financial press and the numbers are impossible to dismiss, that he has made an error of assessment that compounds the longer it goes uncorrected. Richard Whitmore had called Gerald Foss 9 years ago. Not Eleanor. Gerald. He had asked Gerald to come to Greenwich on a Tuesday afternoon, and they had sat in the library, the room with the first edition shelves and the partner's desk that had been his own father's and the single malt scotch that Richard reserved for conversations that mattered. And Richard had told Gerald that he wanted to change the estate documents. Gerald, who had been the Whitmore family's estate attorney for 26 years, and who had the accumulated discretion of a man who has watched families do complicated things to each other for most of his professional life, had listened without interrupting. When Richard finished, Gerald had asked 2 clarifying questions and then said, I'll need to draft this carefully, and I assume you do not want Eleanor informed at this time. Richard had said, I want Eleanor informed when I'm ready to tell her myself. Put the documents somewhere safe and keep them out of the regular estate file. Gerald had nodded. He had drafted the documents. He had kept them for 9 years in the manner requested. Richard Whitmore had died 14 months ago. Quietly, of a cardiac event in the library he loved, in the chair that had been his father's before him, on a Wednesday afternoon in October when Eleanor had been in Singapore for client meetings. She had flown home immediately. She had sat with her mother through the first terrible days. She had managed, with the same organizational competence she brought to everything, the logistics of a grief that was more complicated than she allowed herself to examine in the immediate weeks following. She had sat at her father's desk in the library and looked at the first edition shelves and thought about a man she had loved and been hurt by and respected and been dismissed by, a man who had been genuinely brilliant about money and genuinely blind about his daughter, and she had felt the unresolvable complexity of grief for someone with whom you had unfinished business that was now permanently unfinishable. Gerald Foss had called her 3 weeks after the funeral. He had asked her to come to his office in Greenwich at her earliest convenience. His voice had the particular quality of a man carrying information he has been waiting to deliver for a long time. She had gone the following Thursday. He had closed the office door and sat across the desk from her and opened a file folder and said, Your father made changes to the estate documents 9 years ago. He was very specific that he wanted to tell you himself when the time was right. He did not, as you know, have the time he expected. So I am telling you instead. He had slid the documents across the desk. Eleanor had read them. She had read them twice. She had sat for a moment in Gerald's office with the papers in her hands and looked at the window and felt something move through her that was not triumph and not vindication and was closer, actually, to grief. The grief of a woman understanding that her father had seen her, finally and completely, and had found a way to say so, and had not found the courage or the moment to say it to her face while he still had the chance. She had not told her mother. She had not told Ashton. She had asked Gerald what the timeline required, and Gerald had said that there was no legal obligation to disclose prior to the formal reading of the estate, which he had scheduled for the first of the new year. You have until the holidays, he had said, in the neutral tone of a man presenting facts. Eleanor had sat for a moment longer. Then she had said, Then I'll come to the holidays. Gerald had looked at her with the expression of a man who had known the Whitmore family for 26 years, and was beginning to understand that the most interesting chapter was only now beginning. He had said, I'll be there as always. And Eleanor had said, I know. Make sure you bring your copy of everything. She had driven back to Manhattan that evening through the darkening Connecticut countryside, the bare trees going black against a pewter sky, the highway opening up ahead of her, and she had thought about everything, and then she had called Priya, not Priyanka from the firm but Priya, her college roommate, her oldest friend, and said, "Something happened. I'll explain over dinner. But I think I need you to know that I'm okay." Priya had said. "Are you actually okay, or are you saying okay in that way you do?" Eleanor had considered this. "I'm actually okay," she had said. "I think I might be more than okay. I just need to get through one more family dinner." The family dinner was tonight. The first 2 courses had passed without incident, or without the specific incident that was coming, which is not the same thing. The incident that had been coming for 41 years. Ashton had held court at his end of the table with the easy fluency of someone who has never questioned his right to the room's attention. Stories about his latest venture, a commercial real estate development project in Stamford that he had been working on for 2 years with funding that had required more of their mother's patient support than anyone mentioned aloud, delivered with the self-deprecating charm of a man who finds his own struggle endearing. His wife, Candace, laughed at the right moments and refilled her wine glass at a pace that Eleanor tracked without judgment. The 2 business associates and their wives admired everything appropriately. Rosa brought the crown roast and Gerald Foss complimented it with the warmth of a man who has been eating Rosa's cooking for 30 years and has never lost his genuine appreciation for it. And then Patricia Whitmore, née Hargreaves, 67 years old, Eleanor and Ashton's mother, a woman of genuine elegance and deeply calcified certainties, set down her wine glass and reached for her own, lifted it and said, "Before we go any further, I want to say something." The table quieted with the immediate, practiced attention of people who understood that when Patricia Whitmore spoke at her own table, you listened. She looked around the table with the particular expression of a woman delivering news she considers both significant and settled. Her eyes were bright. She had dressed tonight with extra care. Her mother's pearls, the midnight blue dress she saved for important occasions. She had been planning this moment, Eleanor understood, and had wanted it to land with the weight of ceremony. "This family has been through a very difficult year," Patricia said. "We lost Richard. We lost the man who built everything this family has and everything this family is. And it has been..." Her voice caught, briefly, genuinely. "It has been the hardest thing I have ever survived." She paused. Around the table, heads nodded. Candace put her hand over Ashton's. "But Richard believed in this family. He believed in its future. And I believe it is time, as we close out this year and look toward the next, to make clear what that future looks like." She turned, with the warmth of someone making a point they have been looking forward to making, to Ashton. "Ashton, your father always said that you were the one who carried his spirit, his drive, his vision. And it is my intention, and I believe it was your father's as well, that you will be the one to lead this family forward. The estate, the properties, the legacy, all of it." She raised her glass. "To Ashton. To the future of the Whitmore family." 12 people raised their glasses. "To Ashton," they said, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and drank. Eleanor did not raise her glass. She set it down very slowly on the table in front of her. She felt the eyes, Rosa's at the far end, steady and attentive. Gerald's from his seat near the head, carefully neutral. She felt the specific silence of 12 people choosing, consciously or not to look directly at her in this moment. She felt 41 years of being the quiet one and the serious one and the capable one and the one who did not carry the spirit, the one who did not embody the vision, the one who sat in the middle of the left side of the table in the position that was neither prominent nor banished, the position of careful management. She reached into the bag that was hanging from the back of her chair. It was a structured black leather bag, Celine, understated and excellent, the kind of bag that costs what it costs and does not announce it. She removed a sealed envelope. Cream-colored. Heavy stock. Sealed with a gold adhesive tab on which the name of the law firm Foss, Harrington and Associates was embossed in small, precise letters. There were 3 of them. 3 envelopes, one for each of the relevant parties, prepared by Gerald at her request the previous week. She set them on the table in front of her with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has been waiting a very long time for the right moment and is not going to rush it now that it has arrived. She looked at her mother. She looked at Ashton. She looked at Gerald Foss, who met her eyes with the expression of a man who has carried a secret for 9 years and is experiencing the specific relief of a burden nearly laid down. And she said, in the same clear, carrying voice she used in boardrooms where $11 billion of other people's money was under discussion, "Mom, before everyone drinks to that, I think you should open yours first." Patricia Whitmore looked at the envelope in front of her with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected variable in a situation they believed was entirely under their control. "What is this?" "It's what Dad actually left," Eleanor said. "Gerald prepared copies for you and Ashton. Gerald, do you want to explain the timeline or shall I?" Gerald Foss set down his wine glass with the careful precision of a man who had known this moment was coming and had decided, some time ago, that he was glad to be present for it. "Patricia," he said, "perhaps you should read the document before we continue." The room had gone very quiet. Not the polite quiet of a table pausing for a toast, but the specific, attentive quiet of people who understand that something is happening that they do not fully understand yet, and that it would be inadvisable to miss any of it. Patricia Whitmore opened the envelope with the careful movements of someone who is performing composure while not entirely feeling it. She removed the documents, 4 pages, the covering letter and the trust instrument and the schedule of assets and the attestation page with Richard Whitmore's signature, and the notary seal and Gerald's own signature as the witnessing attorney. She read the covering letter. She turned to the first page of the trust instrument. She read the operative clause, the one that had been drafted by Gerald 9 years ago at Richard Whitmore's specific instruction and that named, without ambiguity and with extensive legal fortification, Eleanor and Whitmore as the sole controlling beneficiary of the Richard Whitmore Family Trust, which held title to the Greenwich estate, the investment portfolio, the 3 commercial properties in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and the family's remaining interests in the company Richard had sold 11 years ago, the proceeds of which had been placed in trust with Eleanor as beneficiary and Ashton as a discretionary income beneficiary with distributions at the trustees' Eleanor's discretion. Patricia read it twice. The room waited. At the far end of the table, Rosa sat very still with her hands folded in her lap and the expression of someone who is not surprised and is not going to pretend to be. "This isn't." Patricia looked up. Her face had done something complicated. Shock and confusion and something that might have been the beginning of a grief she was not yet ready to name. "Gerald, what is this?" "It is what Richard asked me to prepare 9 years ago," Gerald said. "He was very specific. He asked that it be kept outside the regular estate file until the time was right. He intended to explain it to the family himself. He did not have the opportunity." He paused. "I am sorry, Patricia. I am sorry he did not have the chance to do this the way he intended." Ashton had opened his envelope. He was reading. His face had gone through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, recalculation, something that was trying to be outrage but could not fully settle into it because the document in his hands was clearly and professionally what it claimed to be. He looked up at Eleanor. "You knew about this?" "Gerald told me after Dad died," Eleanor said. "Yes. And you didn't say anything. Dad wanted to tell you himself. He didn't have the chance. Now Gerald has told you. Now you know. This is..." He stopped. He looked at the document again. He was a man trying to reorganize a worldview that had been constructed over 38 years and was currently in the process of not surviving contact with 4 pages of estate documentation. "Eleanor, this is the entire estate." "It is," she said. "Yes. He left everything to you. He left everything to the trust, with me as controlling beneficiary. The distinction matters legally, but yes. Effectively, yes." The silence at the table had taken on the specific texture of 18 people recalibrating simultaneously. The business associates and their wives were managing their expressions with the professional discipline of people who understood they were witnessing a private family moment and did not want to be seen enjoying it, which several of them privately were. Candace was looking at Ashton with an expression that was trying to be supportive and was also clearly doing rapid calculations. Gerald was looking at his wine glass. Rosa was looking at Eleanor, and her expression, the expression of a woman who had worked in this house for 31 years and watched everything from the far end of every table, was the only one at that table that contained no surprise whatsoever, only a kind of slow, confirmed satisfaction, the expression of someone who had known, for a very long time, how the story was going to end and had simply been waiting for the ending to arrive. Patricia set the documents on the table with the careful movements of someone managing a great deal at once. She looked at her daughter, Eleanor. Her voice was different, the certainty gone from it, the carefully rehearsed assurance of the toast completely evaporated, replaced by something that was navigating toward an emotion it had not yet named. "Your father never," she stopped. "He never told me." "I know," Eleanor said. Her voice was not cruel. It was not triumphant. It was the voice of someone who has had 14 months to process something and has arrived, through genuine effort, at a place that is neither revenge nor resentment but simply clarity. "I think he was trying to find the right moment. I think he found it harder than he expected. I think he ran out of time." She paused. "I'm sorry he ran out of time. I am. But the documents are what they are." "He always said," Patricia began and then stopped because what she was about to say was that Richard had always said Ashton would lead the family forward, and she was now in the process of understanding that Richard had said this at the dinner table and then gone to Gerald's office and done something entirely different, and the space between those two things was something she was going to need time, private time, not this table, not these witnesses, to understand. "Mom," Eleanor said, "I'm not going to do anything that harms this family. I want you to know that. The house is yours for your lifetime, that's in the trust, clearly. Ashton has income distributions. Nothing is being taken away. What's changed is who makes the decisions going forward." She looked at her mother steadily. "That's me. That's what Dad decided." The rest of the evening was quieter than the first half. Not coldly quiet, the food was still served, the Bordeaux was still poured, the persimmon pudding still came out of the kitchen with Rosa's habitual efficiency and received its habitual appreciation from Gerald, who was the only person at the table behaving with complete normalcy, possibly because he was the only person at the table for whom complete normalcy was an achievable state at this point. Conversations resumed in the tentative, adjusted way of conversations that have been recalibrated. Ashton ate without speaking for a long period and then, toward the end of the meal, said something to Candace that Eleanor could not hear and that Candace received with the careful nod of a woman deciding, wisely, not to respond until they were in the car. Patricia asked Rosa for more coffee in the same tone she always used, because some behaviors are too habitual to yield even to seismic events, and Rosa brought it without any variation in her own manner, because Rosa was a professional and also because she had been waiting for this evening for approximately 9 years and she intended to enjoy it quietly and from the inside. After the guests had gone and Ashton and Candace had left with the strained good manners of people performing normalcy at high cost, after Patricia had gone upstairs with her documents tucked under her arm and the expression of a woman beginning a very long private reckoning, after Gerald had put on his coat and shaken Eleanor's hand with both of his and said simply, he would be proud. After all of this, Eleanor stood alone in the dining room of the Greenwich estate for a few minutes. The candles had burned low. The chandelier threw its warm Venetian light over the table with its half-cleared plates and empty wine glasses and the cream-colored envelopes still lying where they had been read. The snow outside had continued through the evening and the grounds were deep white now, silent, the old trees holding their snow weight with the patience of things that have been here much longer than any of the people inside. Rosa came in to begin clearing. She moved around the table with the efficiency of 31 years, stacking plates with the quiet competence of someone who does everything correctly and has never needed to be watched to do it. She came around to Eleanor's side and paused, and she looked at Eleanor with the full, direct look of a woman who has earned the right to it, and she said, "Your father used to come in here on Sunday mornings when the house was quiet and sit at this table with his coffee and his papers. The last few years he talked about you. More than you know." Eleanor looked at her. She felt, behind the composure she had been maintaining all evening, the familiar ache of something that had no clean resolution, love and loss and the specific grief of being seen too late, or almost too late, or close enough to late that the difference felt technical. "Did he?" she said. "Not a question exactly." "He showed me something once," Rosa said. "From a financial magazine. A profile. He had cut it out." She paused. "He kept it in his desk drawer. In the library." She held Eleanor's gaze for one more moment and then returned to her work, moving around the table with her plates and her 31 years of seeing everything clearly. Eleanor stood for another moment. Then she walked through the house, through the hallway with the family photographs she had grown up ignoring because she had never appeared in them the way she had wanted to, through the library with the partner's desk and the first edition shelves and the single malt scotch still on the side table, one measure poured and unfinished, which was so specifically her father that it hit her like a physical thing, and she sat down at his desk. She opened the center drawer. And there it was, a page torn carefully from a financial magazine, folded in thirds, softened at the fold lines from repeated opening. She unfolded it. Her own face looked back at her, the photograph from the profile, the one she had agreed to reluctantly, the one headlined "The Billionaire Nobody Saw Coming." In the margin in her father's handwriting, the handwriting she had known her whole life, the handwriting on birthday cards and school notes and legal documents, 2 words, "That's her." Eleanor sat at her father's desk for a long time. The snow was still falling outside the library window. The house was quiet around her in the way of houses that hold a great deal of history and have learned to carry it without noise. She held the page in her hands, her own face and her father's handwriting and the 2 words that were not the conversation she had needed and was never going to have now but were. She was going to decide enough. Not everything, but enough. She refolded it carefully. She put it in the pocket of her bottle green cashmere dress. She stood up from the desk that had been her father's and before that his father's. She turned off the library lamp. She walked back through the house and collected her coat and her bag and the tin she had brought for Rosa, which she left on the kitchen counter with a note. She let herself out through the front door into the cold December air and stood on the front step of the Greenwich estate for a moment, looking at the snow-covered grounds and the old trees and the long driveway going dark toward the road, the same ground she had looked at from every window of her childhood, the ground she could now, if she chose to, call hers. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, underneath the complexity and the grief and the particular exhaustion of an evening that had required everything she had, something quieter and more durable. The feeling of someone who has been building something real for a very long time and has finally been handed the deed to the ground beneath it. Not a surprise exactly. More like a confirmation. More like the world catching up to what was always true. She walked to her car. She started the engine. She pulled down the long driveway and turned onto the road toward Manhattan, the headlights opening up the dark in front of her, the snow still coming down in the quiet, absolute way of snow that intends to cover everything, and she drove south through the Connecticut night toward the city she had built herself in, toward the office where $11 billion of other people's money was managed with the daily, unspectacular excellence that had made her who she was, toward the life she had. Constructed piece by careful piece from nothing but her own refusal to accept the story someone else had tried to write for her. She drove for a while in silence. Then she called Priya. Priya answered on the first ring. "Well," she said. Eleanor thought about where to begin. She thought about the toast and the envelopes in her mother's face and the cutout magazine page in her father's desk drawer and Rosa's words and the single malt scotch poured and unfinished on the side table in the library. She thought about 41 years of being the quiet one, the serious one, the capable one, the one who sat in the middle of the left side of the table in the position of careful management. She thought about the condemned lot, not her mother's lot, that was someone else's story, but her own version of it, the 2-room Midtown office and the 3 of them and their collective savings and the philosophy of investment that everyone said was unfashionable and that had turned out year after year to simply be correct. It went, she said, exactly as it needed to go. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you coming back tonight?" "I'm coming back tonight." "I'll open the good wine," Priya said. "The one we've been saving." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Let's open that one." She drove on through the snow, south toward the city, south toward everything she had built and everything she was going to build, the lights of the highway opening ahead of her in the dark like a path someone had laid out with the specific intention that she follow it, which in a way she now understood was exactly what had happened. Her father had seen her. He had seen her and found the only language available to him to say so, not with words at the dinner table, not with the warm, direct acknowledgement she had needed and deserved and had stopped waiting for years ago, but with 4 pages of carefully drafted legal documentation and a cutout magazine profile in a desk drawer and 2 words in the margin in his handwriting. It was not everything. It was not the conversation they should have had 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or the year before he died, the year when there had still been time. It was not the apology or the explanation or the full accounting of all the ways the story had been told wrong and all the ways she had been managed into the margins of a room she was born in. It was not enough in the absolute sense, and it was never going to be enough in the absolute sense, because he was gone and the conversation was permanently unfinishable, and grief does not resolve into satisfaction no matter how cleanly the documents are drafted. But it was something. It was real. It was, in the language her father had always been most fluent in, the language of money and legal instruments and written intentions. It was as close to "I see you and I am sorry and I was wrong about the story" as he had known how to get. Eleanor Whitmore drove south through the Connecticut snow with her father's handwriting in her pocket and $11 billion of responsibility waiting in Manhattan, and the Greenwich estate resolving, in the rearview mirror, into the dark. She drove and she thought about what came next. The formal estate reading in January, the conversations with her mother and her brother that were going to be difficult and necessary, and were going to require the same patient, clear-eyed approach she brought to every negotiation that mattered. The work of being a family after a revelation, which was its own kind of restructuring and would take longer than any legal document could set a timeline for. The Gulf Coast project. No, that was someone else's story. Her projects. The firm's next fund, which they were closing in March. The junior partners she was developing. The work, always the work, which had never once let her down. She thought about her mother, upstairs with the documents and the beginning of a reckoning. She thought about Ashton in the car with Candace reconfiguring. She thought about Rosa, clearing the table with her 31 years and her clear eyes and the expression of someone who had known all along. She thought about her father in the library on Sunday mornings with his coffee and his papers and the magazine profile in his desk drawer, reading about his daughter in the careful, private way of a man who had not found the courage to say out loud what he was willing to write in a margin. She thought, "I forgive you." Not completely, not cleanly, not all at once. But enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to do the work. Enough to open the good wine with Priya tonight and wake up tomorrow and run the thing you built and know with the full knowledge of someone who has been building real things for a long time, that it is yours. That you are and have always been exactly who you needed to be. That the story was never the one they told at the table. The story was always the one you were writing, quietly and seriously, and with the complete, unassailable competence of someone who was never waiting for the room's permission to begin. The highway opened ahead of her. The snow came down. She drove on.